At 30,000 feet, a man held the controls of a dying aircraft. A man who, for 6 years, had told everyone he was just a construction worker, just a dad, nothing more. But the 3 armed hijackers pacing the cabin didn't know what they had walked into. The bleeding first officer didn't know. The 22 terrified passengers didn't know. Even his own 8-year-old daughter didn't know. And as the fuel alarm screamed and the storm swallowed the jet whole, Reid Callahan had exactly one choice left: stop pretending to be ordinary or let 23 people die. If you've never hit that subscribe button before, right now is the moment. Stories like this one don't come through your feed every day. Hit subscribe, tap the like button, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. You'll want to be here for every part of what comes next. The airport was the kind of place that stripped a person down to their worst version. Gate B-17 at Denver International had been holding passengers for 6 hours by the time the third delay announcement crackled through the overhead speakers. The plastic chairs had long since filled up. People were sitting on their carry-on bags, leaning against the walls, letting their kids run loose between the legs of strangers who were too tired to care. The windows were fogged with body heat, and outside, heavy gray snow was pressing against the glass like it had a grudge. Reid Callahan sat at the far end of the gate, his back against the wall. That wasn't an accident. It never was. He had his left knee up, one arm resting across it, and his eyes were doing what they always did in crowded spaces: moving. Gate agent at the desk. 2 exits. A woman near the windows who'd been on her phone for 40 minutes without once actually speaking into it. A heavy-set man in a red jacket who kept checking the same direction every 90 seconds. Reid logged these things the way some people log grocery lists, automatically, without emotion attached to it. It was just the way his brain was wired, and after 6 years of trying to rewire it, he'd stopped fighting. Beside him, Sophie was asleep. She'd been asleep for almost 2 hours, which was its own small miracle given the noise level. She was curled sideways in the plastic chair with her head on his thigh, her dark hair fanned out across his jeans, her mouth hanging slightly open the way it always did. She was clutching a worn stuffed rabbit named Captain Biscuit, whose left ear had been repaired 3 times with mismatched thread, because Reid was not by any measure a skilled seamstress. The rabbit looked like it had survived a war, which, in the Callahan household, it sort of had. Reid kept his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. He watched the gate. The original flight, a commercial connection through Denver to Portland, had been canceled at noon. Mechanical issue, the gate agent had said, though her face told a slightly different story. By 2 o'clock, the rebooking options were grim. The next available flight didn't leave until the following morning, and the hotel situation in Denver that particular weekend, thanks to some massive convention downtown, was essentially non-existent. Reid had called his office manager, left a voicemail for the site foreman, and then sat down to think through the problem the same way he thought through every problem, quietly, methodically, and without catastrophizing. That was when a woman in a charcoal blazer approached the desk, not as a passenger, but with the specific kind of calm authority that meant she owned something in this airport, or close to it. She spoke to the gate agent for about 3 minutes. Reid watched the gate agent's posture change, the subtle shift from someone managing a crisis to someone receiving a solution. The woman in the charcoal blazer said something that made the agent nod twice, quickly, and then gesture toward a corner of the terminal that passengers didn't normally go. Then the woman turned around, and her eyes swept the gate area the same way Reid's had. He clocked that immediately. She was 30, maybe 31. Dark blonde hair pulled back, but not the kind of pulled back that said she'd done it in a hurry. It looked intentional, precise, like everything else about her. High cheekbones, composed expression, the kind of person who had been told all her life that she was intimidating and had decided a long time ago that was fine with her. But it was the way she scanned the room that caught Reid's attention. Most people, when they walk into a crowded space, look for somewhere to put themselves. She wasn't doing that. She was assessing. Who was distressed? Who was traveling alone? Who looked like they might need something? He'd seen that look before, usually in people who'd been responsible for others in bad situations. She held a brief, quiet conversation with a middle-aged man traveling with what appeared to be his mother, who was sitting in a wheelchair with a look of absolute exhaustion. Then she walked over to a young woman with a toddler on her hip, who looked like she was about 30 seconds from either crying or breaking something. She said something, and the young woman's shoulders dropped about 2 inches. Reid watched all of this. Then the woman in the charcoal blazer looked directly at him. She walked over without any particular hesitation, which told him something. "I'm Evelyn Carrington," she said. She didn't offer her hand, which he appreciated. He had a sleeping child on his leg, and repositioning would have been awkward. "I have a private aircraft departing for Portland in about 90 minutes. I have room for several additional passengers. I'm not charging for seats. I'm just trying to get people home. Would you and your daughter like to come?" Reid looked at her for a moment. "Why?" he said. She tilted her head slightly, not annoyed, more like it was the first question she'd actually found interesting in a while. "Because my company has a jet sitting on a runway that can hold 12 more people than I need, and there are 23 people in this gate who can't get home tonight. Seemed like a waste." "And the people you picked?" "I walked around the gate. I looked for people who were genuinely stuck. Not inconvenienced, but actually stuck. You've been sitting in that corner for 4 hours and you haven't complained once. You haven't approached the desk, and you haven't let go of that little girl. I assumed you had somewhere you needed to be." Reid looked down at Sophie. She'd shifted slightly, pulled Captain Biscuit tighter. "Portland," he said. "Portland," she confirmed. He thought about it for exactly the amount of time it took him to make sure he didn't have a good reason to say no. Then, "Yeah, okay, thank you. We leave in 90 minutes from Terminal C, private side. I'll have someone come find you when it's time." She left. Reid watched her go, then looked back at the gate. Evelyn Carrington. He'd heard the name before. He didn't follow business news closely, but Carrington Industries had been impossible to avoid. She was something like the youngest person to take over a Fortune 500 company, though Reid had never bothered to look up the details. He wasn't particularly impressed by that kind of thing. Wealth had always struck him as a lousy measure of a person. He looked back down at Sophie. "Hey." He touched her shoulder lightly. "Soph, wake up. Change of plans." Sophie's eyes opened slowly, unfocused the way they always were when she came up from deep sleep. She blinked at him. "Did they call our flight?" "No, we're getting a different flight." "Is it a big plane?" "Smaller than usual." She thought about that. "Does it have pretzels?" "I honestly don't know." "I'm going to ask," she said, sitting up and grabbing Captain Biscuit by the head, in the way that always made Reid wince slightly on the rabbit's behalf. "Sure," Reid said. "Be polite about it." "I'm always polite." "You once told a hotel receptionist that her computer was taking a long time because it was old and sad." Sophie considered this. That was helpful information. Reid stood, pulled both their bags off the floor, and didn't let himself smile until he'd turned away. The aircraft was a Gulfstream G650. Reid recognized the model from a distance, which was the kind of detail he sometimes caught himself wishing he didn't notice. The fuselage lines, the engine placement, the wing configuration. These things registered automatically, filed away somewhere behind his eyes. He knew the G650's range, its cruising altitude, its approximate passenger capacity. He knew a few other things about it too, from a different chapter of his life that he kept the covers firmly closed on. What he focused on instead was Sophie's face as they walked across the tarmac. Her eyes went wide. "Dad?" she said. "It's tiny." "It's not tiny, it's just not the airport kind." "It looks like a toy." "It's not a toy." "Can I touch it?" "No?" She touched it anyway, the flat of her palm against the fuselage as they passed the nose, and Reid let it go because she'd already done it and the plane didn't seem damaged. Inside, the cabin was the kind of interior that made Reid immediately aware of his jeans and work boots. Cream leather seats, 8 of them arranged in facing pairs, a small galley at the rear, soft cabin lighting that cost more than most people's cars. The other passengers were boarding ahead of them. The man with his elderly mother, who was being helped into a forward seat with careful hands. The young woman with the toddler, who looked marginally less like she was about to break something. 2 businessmen traveling together who had the look of people accustomed to exactly this type of aircraft. An older couple who were holding hands and saying nothing, and a few others Reid categorized quickly and filed away. Sophie walked down the aisle with the solemnity of someone inspecting a museum. "These seats face each other," she said. "I see that. If I sit there, I'd be looking at someone the whole time. That's how it works. What if I don't like looking at them?" "Sophie." She picked a window seat on the right side, 3 rows back, and installed herself and Captain Biscuit with great deliberation. Reid took the seat across from her, angled so his back wasn't fully to the aisle. Old habit, non-negotiable. Evelyn came aboard last, after a brief conversation on the tarmac with a man who Reid assessed as security, earpiece, posture, the way he stood with his weight distributed like someone who expected to move quickly and needed his footing. She settled into a forward seat, opened a laptop, and became immediately absorbed in whatever was on the screen. The cabin door closed. The co-pilot, a young woman named Ortega, who had introduced herself as first officer, came through to confirm head count and do a brief safety run-through. She had the practiced delivery of someone who'd given the speech 1,000 times, but she caught Sophie's eye when she got to the part about oxygen masks, and Sophie held up Captain Biscuit with complete seriousness to indicate that the rabbit was also paying attention. Ortega didn't crack a smile during the speech, but Reid caught the corner of her mouth moving as she turned back toward the cockpit. The aircraft began to taxi. Sophie pressed her face to the window and narrated everything she could see in a low, focused murmur that Reid had long since learned was her processing mode. When Sophie Callahan went quiet but moving lips, her brain was working hard. He let her work. He leaned back in his seat and let his eyes close. He didn't sleep. He never fully slept in moving vehicles. But he let the hum of the engines and the rhythm of the aircraft's motion hold him in the place just beneath conscious thought, the place where things felt almost manageable. Portland was 6 hours behind schedule. Sophie had school Monday morning. He had a framing crew on a site in Beaverton starting at 7 a.m. that was already behind because of a lumber delivery that had gone to the wrong address. These were the things that occupied his mind. These were the problems he was allowed to have now. Normal, fixable, human-scale problems that didn't involve anyone dying. He stayed in that place for a while. The storm hit somewhere over Idaho. Reid felt it before the aircraft registered it on his body, a subtle shift in engine pitch, a slight change in the pressurization of the cabin that most people wouldn't notice. He opened his eyes. Outside Sophie's window, the sky had gone the color of old iron. The turbulence started gradually, the kind that's unpleasant but manageable, brief lurches, a rattling of overhead storage, drinks sliding slightly on the galley counter. Sophie grabbed the armrests with both hands and went very still, which was how Reid knew she was actually scared. His daughter was not a person who went still for no reason. "It's okay," he said quietly. "This is normal." "How do you know?" "Because the plane is still flying." She thought about that. "That's a low bar, Dad." "It's a reliable one." She didn't look entirely convinced, but some of the color came back into her face. Around the cabin, other passengers were reacting in the ways people react. The older couple were holding hands tighter. One of the businessmen was gripping the armrests. The young woman with the toddler had pulled the child into her lap and was making low shushing sounds that were mostly for herself. Evelyn Carrington had closed her laptop and was looking at the ceiling with an expression Reid couldn't quite read. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something more controlled, someone running calculations behind a composed face. Then the intercom crackled, and something in the sound of it was wrong, not what was said. What came before the words, a scrambled, broken quality that didn't match normal intercom static, like the transmission was fighting to come through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to ask everyone to," the voice cut out. Then the door to the cockpit opened, and a man walked out who had not been part of the crew. He was perhaps 40, average height, wearing a gray jacket that hung slightly wrong on the left side. Too much weight there, not fabric weight, something else. He stopped at the front of the cabin and looked at the passengers the way you look at a problem you've already solved. "Everyone stay seated," he said. He wasn't shouting. That was the thing. He said it the way you'd say it to children in a classroom. Routine, almost bored. The second man appeared from the rear galley. Reid had not seen him board. The third came through the cockpit door behind the first, pulling it mostly closed but not latching it. Reid's right hand, which had been resting on his knee, went still. His breathing slowed. Something in his chest shifted. Not fear, but something older and more deliberate than fear. Something that recognized the shape of the situation with a cold, clear precision he had spent 6 years trying to bury. He heard Sophie make a small sound. "Dad," she whispered. "Don't move," he said quietly. "Just don't move." Across the cabin, Evelyn's eyes found his. And there it was. The thing she would later say she saw, though she wouldn't have the words for it in this moment. Reid's face had not changed. No color draining, no widening of the eyes, no jaw tightening with panic. Every other person in that cabin was responding visibly, the way humans respond when suddenly confronted with mortal threat. Reid Callahan was doing something else. He was counting 3 visible men, positioning, front, rear, middle front. The one near the cockpit was the problem. The rear one was keeping distance, which meant either he was the least confident or he had a role that required him to stay back. The middle man, the one who'd spoken, was the point of contact, the one who'd been told to manage the passengers. Reid's eyes went to the cockpit door. It was not fully latched. He heard something through that gap that he didn't want to hear, a voice he didn't recognize saying something short and hard, and then a sound that might have been a scuffle, and then nothing. His hand pressed flat against his thigh. Sophie was watching him with the kind of precise, frightened attention that children deploy when they understand that the adult they most trust in the world is the only thing standing between them and something they can't name. She had never in her life seen her father look like this. She had seen him tired, distracted, impatient with lumber suppliers, soft when she cried, steady when she was sick. She had never seen this face, whatever it was. Across the aisle, Evelyn Carrington had not looked away from Reid since the men appeared. She was watching him the way a person watches something they don't have a category for yet. The man at the front of the cabin, the point of contact, raised his voice slightly. "I want everyone calm. We're going to explain what's happening, and as long as no one does anything foolish, everyone gets where they're going." Reid was not listening to the words. He was watching the third man, the one near the cockpit door. Because that man had been in the cockpit, and now he wasn't, and that meant someone had sent him out, which meant someone was still in there, which meant the crew was still, or wasn't. The intercom crackled again. This time it wasn't the cockpit. It was the aircraft's autopilot advisory system, and what it said, in its flat synthetic voice, was 4 words that had the potential to end every other problem in that cabin by ending the cabin itself. Terrain warning, terrain warning. The aircraft banked left, sharply, the way it does when the ground proximity system fires automatically. And for approximately 2 seconds, every human being on board was the same, weightless, voiceless, equal in their terror, as the horizon tilted and the straps of their seatbelts snapped taut, and outside the windows the gray storm pressed in from every direction. In those 2 seconds, Sophie grabbed Reid's arm with both hands. He covered her hands with his. The aircraft leveled. The alarm stopped. And in the forward cabin, the man who had spoken, the point of contact, the one who believed he was in control of this situation, looked suddenly less certain. He exchanged a glance with the man near the cockpit door, and what passed between them was not confidence. It was the specific look of people whose plan has developed a problem they didn't account for. "Is there a pilot on this plane?" the point of contact man said, raising his voice over the diminishing hum of the proximity alarm. "Does anyone here have flight experience?" Nobody moved. Reid's eyes went to the cockpit door, then to Sophie. Her face was white. She was holding Captain Biscuit against her chest with one arm and his hand with the other, and her eyes were asking him something she didn't have words for, something that was both please don't and please do, tangled together in the way that only 8-year-olds can manage, because they understand love and need at the same time without being able to separate them. He looked at her for a long moment. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Stay in this seat. Don't move. Don't talk to them. Don't do anything." "Dad? Soph." He waited until she looked directly at him. "I'll be right there." He gestured toward the cockpit door with his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere you can't see." She didn't say anything. She pressed her lips together the way she did when she was trying very hard not to cry and was mostly succeeding. Reid looked across the aisle. Evelyn met his gaze. He wasn't sure what he expected. Fear, maybe, or the blank shock he saw on most of the other faces. Instead, she gave him something very small, a single, deliberate nod. Like she'd already read the situation and reached her own conclusion and was simply confirming that they were on the same page. He thought briefly that he hadn't expected that from her. Then he stood up. He stood up slowly, carefully, with his hands visible, and he said the words that he hadn't said in 6 years, the words he'd promised himself on a gray morning outside a funeral home in Virginia that he would never need to say again in any context that mattered. I have flight experience. The cabin went very still. The point of contact man looked at him the way people look when a variable appears that wasn't in the equation. You're a pilot? Military. I have time in aircraft similar to this. It was approximately true. It was also approximately a tremendous understatement. Reid had flown observation and insertion missions out of Coronado in aircraft that made this Gulfstream look like a sports car. He had also, in a different life, and under circumstances he did not think about if he could avoid it, been the last person to successfully put a damaged aircraft on the ground during a night insertion off the coast of a country he was not technically supposed to be in. None of that needed to be said right now. Get up here, the man said. Reid walked forward. He kept his hands visible, his pace even. He was conscious of every eye in the cabin tracking him, the passenger's fear attaching itself to his movement, needing him to be something solid to look at. He was conscious of Sophie watching his back. He did not look over his shoulder. Looking back would communicate something he could not afford to communicate right now. The man near the cockpit door stepped aside. Reid put his hand on the door. He took one breath, the kind that goes all the way down, the kind that was drilled into him so many years ago that it had become cellular memory, the kind that slows everything down to a workable speed. He opened the door, and what he saw on the other side confirmed what the terrain warning had already told him. The captain was slumped sideways in the left seat, unconscious or close to it. First Officer Ortega was in the right seat, and even in the low cabin light, Reid could see the dark stain spreading across her left side, and the way she was fighting to keep her eyes focused on the instruments, and the way the instruments themselves were telling a story he didn't have time to be frightened by. Off course. Fuel warning, storm on every side. Reid slid into the left seat. Talk to me, he said to Ortega. What do I have? She turned her head toward him slowly, with effort. Her voice was thin but steady. Hydraulics okay. Fuel systems, there's a leak somewhere in the starboard tank. We've been bleeding for I don't know how long. A breath. Autopilot overrode twice. I disengaged it. Another breath. We're about 40 nautical miles east of Boise. There's an emergency strip at... She paused. Blinked hard. At Mountain Home. We can make it if the leak doesn't... Who's on comms? ATC lost us for about 12 minutes. I got them back. Frequency is locked. Reid put his hand on the controls. They had weight. Real feedback. Actual resistance. The aircraft was alive under his hands in the way that aircraft are. Not like a simulation, not like a memory, but present and physical and very, very serious. He keyed the radio. Mountain Home approach. This is Carrington Gulfstream 779er. We have an emergency. Request immediate vectors for landing. We have casualties on board and a fuel system compromise. 2-3 souls on board. How do you copy? Static. Then, through the static, a voice. Carrington 779er, Mountain Home copies your emergency. You are cleared for priority handling. Squawk 7700. Say fuel state. Reid looked at the fuel gauge. He looked at the distance indicator. He did the math quickly, the way he'd been trained to do math when the answer actually mattered. Mountain Home, he said. We're going to need that runway ready. Outside the cockpit windows, the storm was a wall of black and gray and flickering electricity, and somewhere inside it, 23 people were waiting to find out which version of Reid Callahan they'd actually gotten on this plane. He gripped the controls and flew. The radio crackled back immediately, and the voice from Mountain Home approach was calm in the specific way that air traffic controllers are calm during emergencies. Not because the situation doesn't concern them, but because calm is the only thing they have to give you, and they know it. Carrington 779er, turn left, heading 270. Descend and maintain 2000. We have your squawk. Emergency services are being notified. Say number of souls on board and nature of casualties. 2-3 souls, Reid said. Captain is unconscious, unknown cause. First officer has a penetrating wound, left torso, status declining. I am not the licensed pilot. I have military flight experience. I need you to know that going in. A pause. Shorter than Reid expected. Copy, 779er. We copy all. Turning you over to approach frequency now. Stand by. Beside him, Ortega had both hands pressed against her left side. She was doing it with the focused, deliberate pressure of someone who understood anatomy well enough to know what was happening inside her and had decided to manage it the same way she managed everything else, by paying attention and not panicking. Reid had seen that kind of toughness before. It was rarer than people thought. "How long have you been holding that?" he asked, eyes on the instruments. "Since before you came in." She exhaled carefully. "One of them came through the cock." Captain tried to stop him. "He went down fast, I think cardiac, not—" She stopped. "Not what you're thinking. Heart thing. The hijacker didn't touch him." A pause. "Me, he touched." "Okay." "I'm okay." "I know," Reid said, and meant it, because she was still talking in complete sentences and her color, though bad, wasn't catastrophic. "I'm going to need you to stay with me. I need your eyes on that fuel gauge, and I need you to tell me the moment it changes." "I can do that." "And I need you to talk to me about this aircraft. G650. I know the platform, but tell me anything that's running different tonight. Anything that felt off before this started." Ortega nodded, slow. "Rudder response was slightly sluggish out of Denver. I logged it, figured we'd have it looked at in Portland. And the starboard engine's been running about 2% hotter than nominal since, I want to say 90 minutes into the flight." Reid absorbed this without expression. Sluggish rudder in a crosswind approach in a mountain storm was the kind of detail that rearranged the math of a situation. He filed it and kept flying. "Fuel gauge," he said, "holding at 31%, down 3 from when you sat down." He did the math again. It came out slightly worse than before, the way math tends to do when you do it twice, and the second time you're less hopeful. "I'm going to talk to the cabin," he said. "Use the overhead panel." She started to reach, then caught herself as the movement pulled at something painful. Left side. Blue switch. Reid found it, pressed it. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Reid Callahan. I'm in the cockpit. I have the aircraft. We're in contact with air traffic control, and we're being guided to an emergency landing strip at Mountain Home Air Reserve Base in Idaho. Flight time is approximately 22 minutes. I need everyone to remain seated, seatbelts fastened, and stay calm. We're going to get through this." He released the button. He had no way of knowing how the cabin received it. He told himself it didn't matter right now, which was mostly true and only a small lie. He thought about Sophie for exactly 3 seconds. Her white face, her hands gripping Captain Biscuit, the way she'd pressed her lips together. And then he put her somewhere behind a door in his mind that he knew how to close because he'd closed it many times in many bad places, and he focused on the instruments. The storm outside the cockpit was not behaving the way weather is supposed to behave in a narrative sense, meaning it was not building to a climax or giving them dramatic windows of opportunity. It was just relentless, steady, churning, indifferent turbulence that made every adjustment on the controls slightly harder than it should have been, every reading slightly less certain. The aircraft's ice detection system had been chiming on and off for the last several minutes, which meant the leading edges were getting attention they didn't need right now. 779er, Mountain Home approach. Turn further left, heading 255. Descend to 8,000. You are 41 miles from the field. Winds at the surface are 190 at 22, gusting 31. ILS is active on runway 28. How copy? 255, descend 8,000, ILS runway 28, Reid read back. Copy the winds. Gusting to 31 across a runway in a jet with a sluggish rudder and declining fuel, and a first officer who was bleeding through her uniform. Reid made a quiet internal note about the crosswind component and decided not to do anything more with that note for the time being. Behind the cockpit door, the situation in the cabin was developing in ways he could not see but could partially infer. He could hear voices. Not words, just the shape of voices. The particular frequency of people trying to hold themselves together in a small pressurized tube while things went wrong around them. He could hear, faintly, a child saying something, and he thought it was Sophie, but he wasn't certain, and he could not afford to be certain either way right now. What he didn't know was what Evelyn Carrington was doing. What Evelyn Carrington was doing was managing the cabin with the same methodical precision she brought to quarterly earnings calls, which is to say, imperfectly and under significant pressure, but without losing the thread. She had moved to Sophie's row the moment Reid disappeared into the cockpit, not because she'd been asked. She did it because Sophie Callahan was 8 years old and alone, and because Evelyn had a particular and specific inability to watch a child be scared without doing something about it. She didn't examine that tendency often, she just operated according to it. Hey, she said, settling into the seat across from Sophie that Reid had vacated. I'm Evelyn. Sophie looked at her with red-rimmed eyes that were working very hard at not producing tears. I know. It's your plane. It is. Is my dad going to land it? Evelyn held the girl's gaze. There were several things she could have said, reassuring generalities, the kind of softened half-truths adults offer children to buy time. She looked at Sophie Callahan's face and decided, quickly, that this particular child would know the difference. Your dad walked into that cockpit like he'd done it 100 times, Evelyn said. He wasn't scared. I was watching him. He wasn't scared at all. Sophie absorbed this. He's scared sometimes, she said quietly, like she was sharing something confidential. He just doesn't look like it. Yeah, Evelyn said. I got that feeling about him. He thinks I don't know. Sophie pulled Captain Biscuit tighter against her chest. About the scared part. But I know. Evelyn didn't say anything to that. She thought it was probably the truest thing anyone had said in this cabin today. From the front of the aircraft, the point of contact man, who had introduced himself to no one but whom the passengers had begun thinking of collectively as the one in charge, which was its own dark irony given the circumstances, was having a visible problem. His plan, whatever it had been, had not accounted for the captain collapsing, the first officer getting hurt, or the aircraft's navigation system deciding to alarm about terrain in the middle of the Idaho mountains. He was pacing the front of the cabin in a tight, controlled loop that Evelyn recognized as the movement of someone whose certainty was eroding. She watched him the way she watched people in boardrooms when the numbers stopped going the direction they expected. The man in the rear, the one who'd appeared from the galley, who had said almost nothing since appearing, was watching the cabin the way a person watches a fire they've been told to monitor. Not participating. Waiting. There was something in his particular stillness that Evelyn found more concerning than the pacing man, though she couldn't have immediately articulated why. The third man had gone back into the cockpit area and was standing just outside the closed door, which suggested to Evelyn that they were waiting for something from whoever was in there, which meant they needed Reid as much as the passengers did, which meant Reid had leverage he may or may not have been aware of, which meant the situation was not simply what it appeared on the surface. Evelyn's mind did this automatically. It mapped structures of dependency. It was what had made her, at 27, the person her father chose to leave the company to over 4 other executives with more experience. She could look at a complicated situation and find the load-bearing elements, the things that, if moved, changed everything else. Right now, the load-bearing element was Reid Callahan. And Reid Callahan was 40 feet away, flying a damaged aircraft through a mountain storm. What's your rabbit's name? Evelyn asked Sophie. Captain Biscuit. Captain. He's a captain, Sophie said with the mild impatience of someone explaining something self-evident. He's been on a lot of trips. Has he ever been on a trip like this one? Sophie considered the rabbit seriously. Once we were on a ferry and it was really wavy. He didn't like it. A pause. This is worse than that. Probably, Evelyn agreed. Is the man at the front going to hurt someone? Evelyn looked at the point of contact man who was now in a low, urgent conversation with the man from the galley. I don't think he wants to, she said carefully. I think his plan went sideways and he's trying to figure out what to do about it. That's actually scarier, Sophie said. When people don't know what to do, they do bad things. Evelyn looked at her. Where did you hear that? My dad. A beat. He says it about construction sites, too. Accidents happen when nobody knows what the plan is. Evelyn thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about the man in the rear of the cabin who still hadn't moved and wasn't pacing and wasn't talking and had a stillness that had nothing to do with calm. She filed it carefully. In the cockpit, Reid had found a rhythm. It wasn't comfort. There was nothing comfortable about the situation. But it was the functional state that sits just below comfort, the one where your hands know what they're doing and your brain is 3 steps ahead of your hands, and the fear is present but compressed into something that takes up very little room. He'd lived in that state for years, a long time ago. He hadn't missed it. But it was there when he needed it, like a language you stop speaking and then find again when someone puts you in the country. Fuel at 28, Ortega said. Copy. It's accelerating. How much? 3% in about 9 minutes last cycle. Now it's closer to 4 per 10. Reid processed this without looking away from the attitude indicator. At that burn rate, they had a window. It was not a comfortable window. It was the kind of window where you stop thinking about what happens if things go slightly wrong and you focus entirely on making sure things go exactly right. Mountain Home 779er, he said into the radio. We need to expedite. Fuel state is critical and degrading. Request direct vectors. Best rate approach. 779er, understand. Turn right heading 280. Descend to 6,000. You are 27 miles out. Expect ILS approach runway 28. Be advised, we have emergency services standing by. Wind shear advisory is in effect for the approach corridor. Wind shear advisory. Reid added it to the list and kept flying. Reid. Ortega's voice had changed register. Still controlled, but with less margin in it. I hear you, he said, before she said anything else. You're getting worse. I'm managing. Tell me if you stop managing. You'll know, she said, with a dry flatness that under any other circumstance would have been funny. He glanced at her once. She had the overhead light angled slightly to keep the instrument panel readable, and in that light her face was the color of old concrete. But her eyes were still focused. She was still watching the fuel gauge. She was still in the fight. Tell me about the ILS, he said. Is it reliable? Was fully functional at pre-flight. A pause. But the storm's been playing with the VOR signals. I had some drift on the localizer about 40 minutes ago before... She stopped. Before the cockpit. Yeah. Reid made a decision about the localizer drift and did not particularly like the decision he made. He made it anyway, because the alternative was not making a decision, and that was always worse. If the ILS signal degrades on approach, what do I have for visual reference on that runway? Approach lights. If they're running, high intensity, should punch through most of what we're flying through. A breath. The runway is 10,000 feet. You've got room. I need the threshold markings. They'll be there. If I can see them. A moment. Yeah, she said quietly, if you can see them. This was the part of the conversation that neither of them was going to make more of than it needed to be. The visibility in the approach corridor was instrument conditions, meaning you flew the numbers and trusted the instruments, and you did not look up until the instruments told you it was time to look up. And then you had approximately 3 to 5 seconds to acquire the runway visually before you were committed to a go-around, except that a go-around required fuel they did not have, which meant the first approach was the only approach, which meant the runway had to be there when he looked up, which was the kind of math that simplified a situation enormously. He pushed that thought into the same room with all the other thoughts he wasn't going to entertain right now, and he flew. The cabin door opened behind him. He heard it without turning, heard it in the way you hear things you've been half waiting for, with the specific quality of something that was inevitable arriving on schedule. He kept his hands on the controls and his eyes on the instruments. How much longer? It was the point of contact man's voice, closer than Reid expected. He'd come forward without the heavy footstep Reid had been anticipating, lighter on his feet than he looked. Another thing to file. 20 minutes, Reid said. Give or take. We need to be in Portland. We need to be on the ground. Portland isn't an option right now. A pause. That's not... Look at the fuel gauge, Reid said, with the same tone he used when a subcontractor told him a wall was load-bearing when it wasn't. Factual. Not interested in argument. We're bleeding fuel through a starboard tank. At current rate, we don't make Portland. We don't make Boise. We make Mountain Home if we start the approach in the next 12 minutes. That is the situation. You can choose to be upset about it, or you can go back in the cabin and keep everyone in their seats, because if they're not in their seats when we hit that runway, people get hurt. Silence. Then, you better know what you're doing. I know what I'm doing, Reid said. It was mostly true. The part that wasn't true was the part about the crosswind and the rudder response and the wind shear advisory and the fuel window and the ILS signal that might or might not be coherent when he needed it most. None of those parts needed to be part of this conversation. The man went back into the cabin. Reid exhaled slowly through his nose. You handled that well, Ortega said. He's scared. Most people are. Scared people need something to believe in, Reid said. Gave him something to believe in. Ortega made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been pain. Fuel's at 25. Copy. He keyed the radio. Mountain Home approach 779er. Fuel state now critical, requesting immediate approach clearance. We are 18 miles out. 779er, you are cleared for ILS approach runway 28. Contact tower on 118.3. Crash fire rescue standing by. Good luck. Reid switched frequencies. He didn't think about the good luck. People said it when they didn't know what else to say. It wasn't useless. It was just imprecise. Luck had very little to do with what was about to happen. What was about to happen would come down to hands and instruments and a set of skills that had been engraved into Reid's nervous system in a place so deep that 6 years of construction work and school pickups and sewing rabbit ears had not been able to reach. He thought about the last time he'd put a damaged aircraft on a runway under bad conditions. He thought about it for exactly 1 second, the same way you think about the deepest water you've ever been in when you're standing at the edge of it again. Then he stopped thinking about it. Gear down in 8 miles, he said to Ortega. Walk me through it. She moved her hands to the panel. They were not steady hands. He could see them from the corner of his eye, trembling slightly in the way hands tremble when the body is losing the argument it's been having with a wound. But she found the controls. She knew the panel the way a musician knows the instrument they learned on, by feel, not by sight. Gear handle is here, she said. 3 greens confirmed down and locked. Flaps? I've got flaps. Okay. A breath. Okay. Then you've got it. I've got it, Reid said. He meant the aircraft. He also, in the way that men who have spent years being responsible for things bigger than themselves mean it, he meant everything else. The 22 people behind him whose names he didn't know. The first officer bleeding in the seat beside him. The 8-year-old girl with the battered rabbit who was somewhere back in that cabin waiting for the only promise he had ever made that he absolutely could not break. 10 miles out, he began the descent checklist. His hands were steady. That wasn't something he was proud of particularly. It was just how his hands worked in these situations. The same way some people's hands shake when they're frightened and some people's go very still. Reid's went still. He had wondered sometimes, in a detached and honest way, whether that meant something about him. Some fundamental difference in the architecture of his fear response that set him apart from people who were wired more normally. He had never arrived at a satisfying answer. He had stopped wondering about it around the time Sophie was 3, and he realized that having steady hands in a crisis was a survival advantage for a single parent, and he should probably just be grateful. 8 miles. Gear down. 3 greens. Ortega confirmed them. Her voice was thinner now, but her eyes were still on the panel. Outside, the storm swallowed the aircraft completely. There was nothing in the windows but gray-black turbulence and the occasional flicker of lightning somewhere in the clouds off to their left, close enough to make the radio crackle and far enough away to not be the immediate problem. Reid flew the needles. Localizer centered, glide slope centered, airspeed stable, descent rate set, the way he had been trained to fly them in conditions that were considerably worse than this, in aircraft that were less forgiving than this, over terrain that would not have tolerated a missed approach. He flew, and he did not look up. 6 miles. 5. The localizer needle twitched. 779er, be advised, we're seeing some localizer signal interruption due to storm interference. The tower frequency crackled. Recommend you cross-check with glide slope. Signal should restabilize inside 4 miles. It should restabilize. Reid filed the word should in the category of things he was not going to rely on. Copy, he said. 3 miles. The localizer needle drifted left. Not dramatically. 2 dots of deviation, then 3. It was the ILS system getting confused by the weather the way Ortega had warned him it might. And it meant that the instrument guiding him to the center line of the runway was currently telling him a partial truth, which was the most dangerous kind. He cross-checked. Attitude indicator. Heading. Vertical speed. He built a picture of where he was from every source except the one that was drifting, and he flew the picture instead of the needle. Fuel at 22, Ortega said. Her voice had a concentrated quality now, like she was choosing each word carefully and spending only what she could afford. Reid. I know. If we have to go around, we don't. A pause. Okay, she said. 2 miles. The glide slope was solid. The heading was correct. His descent rate was 800 feet per minute, which was right, which meant the runway, if the approach lights were functioning, if the ceiling had any break in it, if any part of this cooperated, should appear in his windscreen at some point in the next 90 seconds. He did not look up yet. He flew the numbers. 1 mile, 600 feet above the ground, 400 feet, 300. The aircraft shuddered. A single sharp turbulence hit from the left side that pushed the nose right and dropped the left wing, and Reid caught it with right rudder and aileron input that was neither fast nor slow but exactly sized to the problem, the way a carpenter makes a cut. Not hurrying, not hesitating, just doing the precise thing required. 200 feet. He looked up. The approach lights were there. 500 feet of strobing white light cutting through the rain and darkness, and beyond them the runway threshold. And beyond that 10,000 feet of wet pavement, that was the most beautiful thing Reid Callahan had seen in a very long time. The crosswind hit them at 150 feet, the gust the tower had warned them about, and the aircraft yawed left in a way that was unambiguous about its intentions. Reid applied right rudder, felt the sluggish response Ortega had mentioned, felt a fraction of a second of delay in the system, and compensated for it automatically because he'd been told about it and had stored the information in exactly the right place. He held the aircraft straight. He crossed the threshold. The wheels hit the runway with a force that was several degrees past gentle, but well short of catastrophic, and the aircraft settled. Not smoothly, not the way it's supposed to feel in a normal landing on a normal day, but with the particular finality of something heavy meeting the ground and committing to it, and Reid got both hands on the thrust reversers and both feet on the brakes and held on. The aircraft skidded. Not a controlled slowdown, a real skid, the back end stepping out slightly to the left as the wet runway gave the tires less than they wanted, and Reid steered into it the way you steer into any skid, which is to say against every natural instinct, and the aircraft straightened. They slowed. They slowed more. At 4,000 feet of runway remaining, the aircraft was moving at taxi speed. At 5,000 feet, it stopped. Reid sat for a moment with both hands still on the controls, and the rain hammering the windscreen and the engine noise winding down, and the sound of his own breathing louder than it had been 30 seconds ago. "Fuel at 18%, Ortega said, very quietly. "Yeah," Reid said. Outside, through the rain, he could see the emergency vehicles coming. Red and white lights strobing across the wet pavement, moving fast, converging on the aircraft from 3 directions at once. He watched them come and felt nothing about it particularly. Not relief, not triumph, nothing cinematic. Just the particular flatness of someone who has done a hard thing and is now very tired. He keyed the radio. "Mountain Home Tower, Carrington 779er is down and stopped. We need medical on board immediately. First officer with penetrating wound left torso. Captain unconscious, suspected cardiac event. 23 souls on board." 779er, copy. "Medical is 30 seconds out. Outstanding work." Reid released the radio switch. He looked at Ortega. She had her eyes closed, her hands still pressed to her side, but she was breathing. Visibly, steadily, with the concentrated effort of someone maintaining something by force of will. "Hey," he said. She opened her eyes. "We're down," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted, the held-together quality giving way just slightly, just enough. "Yeah," she said. "Yeah, we are." Reid set the parking brake. Then he sat back, and for the first time in 22 minutes, he took a breath that went all the way down. Behind the cockpit door, he could hear the cabin beginning to change, voices rising, the sound of people realizing they were on the ground, the particular quality of relief that doesn't know what to do with itself and therefore gets loud. He heard someone crying. He heard what he thought was applause, brief and then embarrassed, the way people applaud on planes when they land and then immediately feel self-conscious about it. He heard, underneath all of that, a specific voice. High, clear, 8 years old. "Dad?" Reid's hand went to the cockpit door. He opened it, and he stepped back into the cabin, and Sophie was out of her seat before he'd taken 2 steps. Captain Biscuit swinging from one arm, her other arm outstretched, her face a mess of tears and relief, and something that had been held together for 22 minutes with sheer 8-year-old determination and was now coming apart all at once. He caught her. She hit him hard enough that he had to take a step back, both arms going around her, her face buried in his shoulder, her whole body shaking with the kind of crying that is actually relief trying to find a way out. He held on. Around them, the cabin was still loud with voices and relief and the sound of the emergency door being prepared from outside. The flashing lights of the rescue vehicles were visible through the oval windows, red and white patterns crossing the walls. People were moving, talking, some of them crying, some of them on phones, some of them just sitting and staring at nothing with the glazed expression of people who have been very frightened and are only now being allowed to stop. Reid stood in the middle of all of it, holding his daughter, and did not move. Across the cabin, Evelyn Carrington sat in Sophie's row and watched the two of them, and she kept very still, and she did not look away. She was trying to understand what she'd seen tonight. In the calm with which Reid had walked to the cockpit, in the steadiness that had come off him like a frequency, in the way the trained military man and the everyday single father had seemed, for those 22 minutes, to be entirely the same person. She had built her career on reading people, on understanding what they were made of before they had to demonstrate it. She had been wrong about people before, and she had learned from it. She had not seen Reid Callahan coming. The emergency door opened, and the paramedics came in from the rain, and the cabin organized itself around the business of surviving. And Reid still held Sophie, and Sophie still held on, and neither of them was in any hurry to let go. Outside the aircraft, on the rain-soaked runway, the storm was already beginning to loosen its grip on the mountains. But none of them knew yet that the hardest part of the night was still ahead. The paramedics moved through the cabin with the practiced efficiency of people who had seen bad things before and had learned to sort them by priority rather than by emotion. The first team went straight to the cockpit, two of them shouldering past the passengers who were still finding their footing, their trauma bags swinging, their radios crackling with shorthand that the passengers couldn't parse and were probably better off not understanding. The second team came in through the main door and began working the cabin systematically, checking faces, asking questions, shining small lights into eyes. Reid stood back and let them work. Sophie had not released her grip on his jacket, but she'd shifted from full-body collapse to something more manageable, standing beside him, one fist still closed around the fabric at his side, her face pressed against his arm. He kept one hand on the back of her head and watched the paramedics work on Ortega, and tried not to calculate how much blood she'd lost by the color of her uniform. The point-of-contact hijacker, the one who'd been managing the cabin, was sitting in the forward section with his hands visible, which meant someone had made him sit down, which meant the dynamic in the cabin had shifted during the landing in ways Reid hadn't been present to observe. He was a compact man, maybe 42, with the specific exhausted look of someone whose plan has been comprehensively dismantled by reality. His two associates were in the rear, the one from the galley and the one who'd been posted near the cockpit. Both seated, both quiet. The quiet one in the rear had not moved since the aircraft stopped. Reid noticed that. He noticed it the way he noticed the gate agent's posture back in Denver, and the way Evelyn had scanned the terminal, and the way Ortega's hands had trembled without losing the panel. He noticed it, and he put it on a shelf in his mind, and he let it sit there while the more immediate problems organized themselves in front of him. An airport security officer in a blue jacket, Mountain Home Base Security by the look of the insignia, came aboard through the main door and identified himself as Senior Airman Kowalski. He had the look of someone who had been briefed on the situation in the 90 seconds it took to run from the security vehicle to the aircraft door, which meant he had approximately half the information he needed and twice the confidence. He was scanning the cabin with the focused attention of someone doing a threat assessment they hadn't been trained for. "Which one of you is Callahan?" he said. "That's me," Reid said. Kowalski looked him over in the way that people look at someone who has just done something they don't entirely believe. "Sir, we need to secure the subjects before we can begin full passenger processing. Can you tell me the current status of the—" "3 of them," Reid said. "Front section, rear section, rear section. The one in the rear on the right hasn't moved since we landed. He was posted near the galley before we touched down, and he didn't participate in the main event." He kept his voice low and level, not for Kowalski's benefit particularly, but because Sophie was still beside him, and he was not going to run a threat briefing at full volume with his daughter's ear 6 inches from his shoulder. "I'd get to him first." Kowalski looked at the rear of the cabin, then back at Reid. Something shifted in his assessment. "Copy that," he said, and turned to wave in the 2 additional officers who were waiting in the doorway. Evelyn appeared at Reid's elbow. She'd been in Sophie's row during the landing, and the first thing she'd done after the aircraft stopped was take inventory of every person in the cabin, their eyes, their hands, their breathing. The way she apparently did everything, which was thoroughly and without wasting time on things she couldn't change. She'd cataloged the three men the same way Reid had, and she'd reached similar conclusions by a different route, and this was evident in what she said next. "The one in the rear," she said quietly, to Reid, not to Kowalski. "He's been watching the door the whole time, not the cockpit door, the main cabin door." Reid looked at her. "He's waiting for something," she said. "Or he's waiting for someone to not show up." Reid looked at the rear of the cabin. The man in question was perhaps 45, heavy through the shoulders, with the specific quality of stillness that Reid had been cataloging since the aircraft stopped. His hands were on his knees, his face was blank. His eyes were on the main cabin door, and they had been since the emergency teams came through it, and they were moving in small increments, measuring, calculating, in a way that had nothing to do with a person who had accepted that the situation was over. "Keep Sophie with you," Reid said to Evelyn. "What are you—" "Keep Sophie with you." He moved. He didn't run. Running in a pressurized cabin full of frightened passengers and active paramedics would have been the wrong signal, would have started a secondary panic, would have eaten the 3 seconds of advantage he currently had. He walked fast, the way he'd learned to walk in rooms where the wrong movement could change everything, and he was 3 rows from the rear when the man in the back seat stood up. He stood in one motion, not the stiff, careful movement of someone who'd been sitting for 20 minutes with adrenaline half gone, but the fluid, coiled motion of someone who'd been waiting for a specific moment and had just determined it had arrived. His right hand went to the left side of his jacket. Reid covered the last 3 rows in 2 steps. He got his right hand on the man's wrist before the hand came out, and what happened in the next 4 seconds was not elegant or cinematic. It was Reid's left forearm across the man's throat and his weight driving them both back into the seat with a controlled violence that was the product of 10 years of training and not of anger, because anger makes you sloppy, and Reid Callahan had never been sloppy in his life. And the man hit the seat back with enough force to knock the intention out of him for approximately 3 seconds, which was the 3 seconds Kowalski needed to cross the cabin and add his own body to the situation. There was a handgun. It clattered to the floor of the aisle when Reid got the wrist at the right angle, and it slid under the seat across from them, and the older couple in the row ahead turned to look at it with the specific expression of people encountering something their brain cannot immediately file correctly. "Don't touch it," Reid said, and the way he said it ensured they didn't. Kowalski got the man's arms behind him. The other 2 officers converged from the front. In under a minute, all 3 hijackers were in restraints, and the secondary officers were moving them toward the door in the careful, practiced shuffle of people who had drilled for exactly this type of extraction. The cabin was very quiet. Then the toddler in the young mother's arms made a loud, declarative sound that was not a word but was clearly meant as commentary, and 3 people laughed. The short, released kind of laughter that has nothing to do with humor and everything to do with the body, needing somewhere to put the tension it had been carrying. Reid picked up his breathing from the floor where he'd apparently left it. He looked down at his hands, still steady. He thought, as he sometimes did at moments like this, that this particular feature of his physiology was something he was grateful for and vaguely unsettled by in equal measure, and that this was probably not the moment to explore it further. He turned around. Sophie was standing 4 rows up, Evelyn's hand on her shoulder, watching him with an expression he had never seen on his daughter's face before. It was not the face she made when she was scared, and it was not the face she made when she was proud. It was something between those 2 things that didn't have a name yet. The face of a child encountering her parent as something other than her parent for the first time, and not entirely knowing what to do with it. He walked back up the aisle. "You okay?" he said to her. She stared at him. She stopped. "You moved really fast." "Yeah." "I didn't know you could move like that." "There are a few things you don't know about me," Reid said. "We're going to talk about that." "Okay," she said. She thought about it. "Not right now, though." "Not right now," he agreed, and pulled her into his side. The process of getting 23 people off an aircraft that had just made an emergency landing following a hijacking turned out to be complicated in ways that were entirely procedural and only slightly less stressful than the preceding hour. There were FBI agents who arrived in two black SUVs 18 minutes after the aircraft stopped and immediately began sorting people into categories that determined how long each person was going to be at Mountain Home Air Reserve Base before they were allowed to go anywhere else. There were base medical personnel who were focused on Ortega and the captain with a single-mindedness that Reid found reassuring. There were base security people who were focused on the three arrested men with similar single-mindedness. And there were representatives from the National Transportation Safety Board who arrived last, drove the most ordinary-looking vehicles, and asked the most precise questions. Reid sat in a beige room in the base operations building with a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold and answered the NTSB investigator's questions for 45 minutes. The investigator was a woman named Holt, Dr. Holt, though she introduced herself without the title and only corrected him once when he dropped it. She was methodical and unhurried in the way of someone who understood that the value of an interview was in its details and that rushing details was how you lost them. She asked him about the fuel system. She asked him about the localizer drift on approach. She asked him about the rudder response he'd noticed and how he'd compensated for it. She asked him about his flight experience with the specificity of someone who was going to verify every word he said, and Reid gave her the specifics, including the parts that were classified by nature and that she would need to go through other channels to confirm, which she noted without surprise. "The first officer," Reid said when there was a pause. "Ortega, is she in surgery?" Holt said. "The wound was deep, but they got to her quickly. The prognosis is favorable." "And the captain?" "Cardiac event, as you suspected. He's stable. They think he'll make a full recovery." She looked at her notes, then back at him. "You said the localizer signal was degrading at approximately 2 miles out. Walk me through what you substituted." He walked her through it. She wrote it down. She asked follow-up questions that indicated she knew exactly what he was talking about, and he adjusted the level of his answers accordingly, and they went on like this until she seemed satisfied that she had what she needed. "I want to be honest with you," she said, capping her pen. "What you did tonight, the actual piloting part of it, was not safe in any conventional sense. You were not rated for this aircraft. You were not current. The conditions were objectively bad, and the aircraft had 3 compounding mechanical issues. Any one of those factors alone would qualify as a serious risk." "I know," Reid said. "I'm telling you because I want to also say, given all of that, the decisions you made were correct. Your technique was sound. Your compensation for the rudder issue was appropriate." She paused. "Whoever trained you did a thorough job." "They did," Reid said. She looked at him for a moment. "You can go. We'll be in touch for the full debrief." Reid stood, picked up the cold coffee out of habit, and then put it back down. "The hijackers," he said. "Have they said anything about why?" Holt's expression did a small, controlled thing. "That's not my end of the investigation. But I will tell you, the one you detained at the rear, the one with the weapon." She paused. "He wasn't part of the original team, or wasn't supposed to be visible to the original team. The FBI is interested in that particular arrangement." Reid thought about the man's eyes on the door, the waiting quality of him. "He was the contingency," Reid said. "That's one working theory," Holt said, which was a careful way of confirming it. Reid nodded once and left. The hallway outside was fluorescent lit and narrow and smelled like industrial cleaner, and Sophie was sitting on a bench against the wall with Captain Biscuit on her knees and a can of ginger ale that someone had given her and Evelyn Carrington sitting at the far end of the bench doing something on her phone. Sophie looked up when he came through the door, and some of the tension around her eyes eased, the specific relaxation of a child who needed to see a specific person and is now seeing them. "How long is this going to take?" she said. "We can leave soon." "Where are we going?" "Hotel tonight, Portland tomorrow." She considered this. "My teacher is going to want a note." "Your teacher is going to get a note that is significantly more interesting than she was expecting." Sophie looked at him for a moment. "Are you in trouble?" "No." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She seemed to accept this, though not entirely. Then, "Dad, you were a SEAL." He sat down beside her. The bench was hard and slightly too low for his height, the way institutional furniture always was, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment before he looked at her. "Yes," he said. Like a real one." "Yes." "The water kind. She was clearly working through a catalog of things she had absorbed about this topic from sources that Reid could not entirely identify. You did the dangerous things. I did dangerous things, yeah. She was quiet. He let her be quiet. Sophie processed by going silent and then coming back with the question she'd actually been building the whole time, and rushing her never produced anything useful. Why didn't you tell me? It was the right question. He'd known it was coming for 6 years, in the general sense of knowing it, the way you know a bill is going to come due eventually without knowing which day. He'd thought about what to say. He'd rehearsed versions of it in his head while watching her sleep, while making her breakfast, while driving her to school. None of the rehearsed versions had felt right because none of them were entirely honest, and Sophie, at 8, had a finely calibrated detector for partial honesty that Reid had learned to respect. Because I was trying to be just your dad, he said. Not a SEAL who was also your dad, just the dad part. She looked at him. Those are the same person. I know that now. I knew they were the same person before now, she said, with the mild firmness she deployed when she felt a point needed clarifying. You're right, he said. Did you land planes a lot? When you were doing the dangerous things? A few times. Is that how you knew how to do it tonight? That's how I knew. She was quiet again. Then she looked at Captain Biscuit, turned him over once in her hands. Mom knew, she said. It wasn't a question. Your mom knew everything, Reid said. Something moved across Sophie's face, brief and complicated and 8 years deep, and then she leaned her head against his arm the way she had at the airport, what felt like several lifetimes ago, and she said nothing more about it. He put his arm around her and she fit against his side in the specific way that kids fit against parents, like the shape was made for it. From the other end of the bench, Evelyn looked up from her phone. She had the expression of someone who has just witnessed a private thing and is deciding whether to acknowledge it or let it pass. She decided to let it pass, which Reid appreciated without saying so. I've arranged for a hotel, she said. The entire group, everyone from the aircraft. I have a corporate account at the Riverside in Boise. It's 40 minutes from here. Cars are coming. She paused. If that's all right? You don't have to do that, Reid said. I know I don't have to. He looked at her. The charcoal blazer was no longer crisp. There were traces of the evening on her, the kind of wear that happened to clothing when a person's body had been through something significant. There was a small tear at the left cuff that she hadn't noticed or had noticed and chosen not to address. She looked like a person who had spent the last 2 hours doing what needed to be done without stopping to assess how she was handling it, and who was possibly going to assess how she was handling it sometime tonight in a hotel room, in private, without an audience. Reid recognized that mode. He had operated in it for years. Thank you, he said. She nodded once. Back to the phone. Moving through a list of things that needed doing with the efficiency of someone for whom a list of things that needed doing was a comfort rather than a burden. Sophie reached over and tugged Evelyn's sleeve once. Evelyn looked down. Thank you for sitting with me, Sophie said. When he was in the cockpit. Evelyn's expression did something brief and genuine that was different from every expression she'd worn since Denver. It wasn't polished. It lasted about 2 seconds, and then she had it back under control, but it was there. Of course, she said. You were good company. Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to most assessments. I was actually pretty scared. I know, you handled it well. My dad handles scary things better than me. Your dad handles scary things differently than most people, Evelyn said. That's not the same as better. She glanced at Reid for a moment, and something passed between the adults in the way that things pass between people who have been through something together and haven't yet decided what to make of each other. Scared and handling it anyway is actually harder. Sophie thought about this. She seemed to find it credible. She went back to looking at Captain Biscuit. Reid looked at the floor. Outside the building, through the narrow windows in the hallway, the storm was breaking up. He could see it. The cloud layers starting to separate, thin places opening up, the first pale suggestion of stars in a gap somewhere to the northwest. The rain had slowed to a drizzle on the window glass, tracking down in the irregular paths that rain takes when the wind behind it has mostly given up. He thought about the fuel gauge at 18%, the localizer needle drifting left in the dark, the moment at 200 feet when he'd looked up and the approach lights had been exactly where they needed to be. white and strobing and indifferent to the drama attached to their appearance. Just lights doing what lights did. He thought about the man in the rear of the cabin and his eyes on the door. He thought about what Holt had said. The contingency. The arrangement that the original team hadn't been supposed to see. Someone had sent that man aboard to ensure the mission's objective was achieved, regardless of how the primary operation unfolded. And the primary operation had unfolded about as badly as a primary operation could. Captain down, first officer wounded, aircraft off course, no leverage, and no landing in Portland. Whatever the mission had been, it had failed comprehensively, which meant someone, somewhere, was aware by now that their contingency had also failed, which meant the thing Holt called a working theory was going to become a working investigation, and that investigation was going to lead somewhere that connected to Evelyn Carrington's aircraft, and Evelyn Carrington's corporate merger, and Evelyn Carrington herself, and none of that was going to be clean or fast. Reid looked at the side of Evelyn's face while she read whatever was on her screen. She knew. Not all of it. She didn't have the NTSB context, didn't have what Holt had said about the contingency arrangement, but she was clearly aware that tonight wasn't just a hijacking that had gone wrong. She was a person who understood structures of dependency, who could look at a situation and find the load-bearing element, and she was staring at her phone with the focused stillness of someone who was doing that right now, and not particularly liking what she was finding. Reid almost said something. He turned it over in his mind, measured its usefulness, and decided the hotel was the better context. Not here, not with Sophie's head against his arm, and the fluorescent lights, and the cold coffee smell of institutional crisis management. There would be time. The FBI was going to make sure there was time. Cars should be here in 15 minutes, Evelyn said, not looking up. The older couple and the family with the toddler are going to ride first. I'd like Sophie to go with them if that's... We'll wait, Reid said. Reid, there's no reason. We'll wait, he said again, and she looked at him, and whatever she saw in his expression confirmed that this was not negotiable and that the reason he was giving was not the only reason. Her eyes moved to Evelyn, then back to him, and she settled. Fine, she said. We'll wait. Sophie made no comment on any of this. She had fallen into the specific drowsy state of a child who has been running on adrenaline and ginger ale for several hours and is now hitting the wall, and her eyes were half closed against his arm. Captain Biscuit was listing sideways. Reid stayed where he was. He went over the rear cabin man one more time in his mind. The timeline, the positioning, the decision to stand when the door opened rather than when the aircraft stopped. He'd been waiting for something specific, not for rescue. People waiting for rescue watched the door hopefully. He had watched it with the flat attention of a person waiting for a specific event to not happen, and when that event had not happened, when whatever signal or contact he was expecting had failed to materialize, he had made his move. Dead man's switch arrangement, possibly. You don't hear from me by the time the aircraft stops. You know what to do. If that was the structure, it meant the handler, the person who'd sent him, had been monitoring the flight, had known it was going to make an emergency landing before Portland, had expected the contingency to act and had not received confirmation that it had, which meant the handler knew, or would shortly know, that all three men were in federal custody, and which meant Evelyn Carrington, who was sitting 12 inches away from Reid Callahan on a beige bench in a beige hallway on a military airbase in Idaho, was not safe. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not until someone understood the full shape of what tonight had actually been. Reid looked at the narrow window and the drizzle tracking down the glass. 40 minutes to Boise. He was going to be awake for most of the night, which was fine. He had done worse things on less sleep, and this particular problem was not going to resolve itself by morning. And the best thing he could do with the next several hours was understand exactly what they were dealing with before whoever was on the other end of tonight's failed operation decided what to do next. Sophie made a small sound against his arm and shifted deeper into sleep. He put his other hand over hers and held on, and he thought about the distance between the man he'd been and the man he was sitting here being right now, and he decided that distance was smaller than he'd spent 6 years pretending it was. The seal and the father. He had believed for a long time they were separate countries. Tonight had made it clear they shared a border, and that border was something you crossed without a passport, in both directions, without always choosing when. Down the hall, Kowalski appeared in a doorway and gave a small nod. Cars were close. Evelyn stood and put her phone away and picked up the light bag she'd carried off the aircraft with the practiced efficiency of someone who traveled constantly and had learned to carry only what mattered. She looked at Reid once, and there was a question in it, and he gave her the small nod that said later, and she accepted it. Reid touched Sophie's shoulder gently. "Hey, cars." She surfaced slowly, eyes blinking, disoriented the way she always was. "Portland?" she said. "Not yet," he said. "Hotel first." She stood and collected Captain Biscuit from the bench with the automatic care of someone tending to a responsibility. She rubbed one eye with the back of her hand. She looked, in that moment, very small, and also, Reid thought, watching her, somehow less fragile than she ever had before, in the particular way that people look after they've been through something real and have come out the other side still themselves. "Dad," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad you were on the plane." He looked at her for a moment, the fluorescent light, the beige walls, the cold coffee smell, the rain at the window. Coffee smell, the rain at the window. All of it was very ordinary and very clear. "Me too, Soph," he said. They walked down the hallway toward the door. The Riverside Hotel in Boise was the kind of place that had been built to impress and had settled, over the years, into simply being comfortable, which was the better outcome anyway. Dark wood paneling in the lobby, thick carpet, the kind of ambient quiet that good insulation and good management produce together. At 11:40 at night, with a group of 21 passengers arriving from a military base in varying states of shock and exhaustion, the front desk staff absorbed the situation with a professional calm that suggested either excellent training or the specific numbness that came from working night shifts long enough. Evelyn had called ahead. The rooms were ready. There were sandwiches and coffee in one of the small conference rooms off the lobby. Because Evelyn had thought of that too. And most people went there first before going upstairs, driven by the animal need to eat something after several hours of sustained fear had burned through whatever they'd had before Denver. Reid took Sophie up to their room directly. She was asleep before he'd finished pulling the blanket over her, which was a mercy. He stood at the foot of the bed for a moment and looked at her. The familiar geography of his daughter sleeping, the way her breathing evened out and her face lost the tension that had been in it since the men appeared in the cabin. Captain Biscuit was wedged between her arm and the pillow. The mismatched thread on his ear was visible in the lamplight. Reid sat in the chair by the window. He did not try to sleep. Outside, Boise was quiet in the way that mid-sized western cities are quiet after midnight. Not empty, but settled, the lights steady rather than moving. He could see the Boise River in the distance, a dark thread between the city lights, and beyond it, the foothills going black against a sky that had finally cleared of storm. Stars now. Actual stars, the kind that only appear after a system moves through and the air is washed clean. He sat with his elbows on his knees and went through the evening the same way he'd go through a post-mission debrief. Not emotionally, not yet, just factually. Timeline, actors, decisions, outcomes. He was looking for the things he didn't understand because the things he didn't understand were where the risk lived. The contingency man bothered him most. Not the act itself. Reid had seen worse, and the physical reality of it was already filed in the appropriate category. Processed. Done. What bothered him was the architecture. You don't send a hidden contingency unless you're not certain your primary team will complete the objective. You don't build that kind of failsafe into an operation unless the objective is critical enough that its failure is unacceptable. And the failsafe had been configured to eliminate everyone, not extract the team, not protect the operation's secrecy in any surgical way, but eliminate the passengers, which was the kind of brutal, total solution that meant the information those passengers might carry was considered more dangerous than the consequences of 23 deaths. That was not a small operation. That was not 3 men with a grievance and a plan they'd worked out over 6 months. That was organization, resources, someone above the 3 men on the aircraft who had decided that Evelyn Carrington's merger was worth 23 lives, including those of a toddler and an 8-year-old and an elderly woman in a wheelchair, and had made that decision calmly and in advance. Reid looked at the river. His phone, which had been returned to him along with his wallet and Sophie's backpack by a federal agent at the base with a form attached, showed 4 missed calls from his site foreman, 2 from his office manager, and 1 from a number he didn't recognize with a 202 area code that he was fairly certain was going to be a federal agency returning his emergency contact information for their records. There was also a text from a number he recognized immediately, a former teammate, the kind of contact that persists beyond service because some people you simply don't lose track of, regardless of how much civilian life you put between yourself and the years you shared. The text said, "Saw the news. You okay?" Reid stared at it for a moment. He typed back, "Yeah, Sophie's fine." The response came in under 30 seconds. "I know about the flight. I mean, are you okay?" Reid set the phone face down on the window sill. He sat in the dark and thought about the question, which was more complicated than it should have been for a man who had just successfully landed a disabled aircraft and neutralized an active threat and gotten his daughter into a hotel bed. He was physically fine. The functional systems were operational. He was not shaking, not flashbacking, not running any of the particular software that sometimes came online unbidden in the years after he'd left the teams. But something had shifted tonight in a way he was going to have to sit with for a while, and he knew it. And he was honest enough with himself not to pretend otherwise. The door he'd kept closed for 6 years, the one with the seal behind it, the one he'd been managing the distance from, had come off its hinges at 30,000 feet, and he didn't think he was going to be able to rehang it. He wasn't sure he wanted to. He wasn't sure what that meant yet. Sophie had said, "Those are the same person." She'd said it like it was obvious. Like the 6 years of careful compartmentalization had been, from her angle, transparent in the way that only a child's angle produces, the unobstructed view that comes from simply not having been taught to look away. He picked the phone back up and typed, "Define okay." "Fair enough," the response came. "Call me when you can." Reid put the phone in his pocket, stood, checked that the security bar on the hotel room door was engaged, and then sat back down in the chair and watched Sophie breathe until he heard the knock at his door at 12:47 in the morning. He knew it was Evelyn before he opened it, the same way he'd known the cockpit situation was worse than the intercom had suggested. Not psychic, just pattern recognition. She was the only person in this hotel who would still be functional at this hour, still moving through the problem instead of sleeping it off. He opened the door. She was in the same clothes, the blazer now gone, a hotel coffee cup in one hand and something that looked like a printed document in the other, and she had the particular expression of someone who has spent the last 2 hours on the phone with people she needed to be patient with and has almost entirely succeeded. "I need to talk to you," she said. "I know," he said, and stepped back to let her in. She came in, glanced at Sophie sleeping, and moved to the small table near the window without being directed. She sat down across from his chair, set the coffee and the document on the table, and looked at him with the direct, functional gaze she'd worn since the terminal in Denver, except that underneath it now was something that hadn't been there before. Not vulnerability exactly, but a kind of weight. The weight of a person who has been given information they didn't want and is now carrying it. "The FBI called me an hour ago," she said, keeping her voice low. "They've been talking to the 3 men in custody, the 2 primary hijackers, the point man and the galley man. They're contracted, hired. They don't know who hired them beyond one contact in a payment structure that's going through 3 shell companies." She paused. "The 3rd man, the contingency. He's different. He's not hired. He's employed. Directly." "By whom?" Reid said. She looked at him for a moment. "You already think you know." "I have a theory," he said. "Tell me yours." "Martin Voss," she said. "He's the controlling shareholder of Voss Capital Group. He has a 22% stake in Carrington Industries through a holding structure that took me 3 years to fully map, and he has been trying to block my merger with Harwell Technologies for 8 months through every legal mechanism available to him." She paused. "When the legal mechanisms ran out 3 weeks ago, he apparently found a different mechanism." Reid absorbed this. What does the merger do to his stake? Dilutes it from 22% to under 8%. And removes 3 board seats that he currently controls indirectly. She turned the printed document on the table, a corporate structure diagram, dense with names and arrows and percentage figures. At 22%, he has effective blocking power over major decisions. At 8%, he's a passive investor. He loses everything he spent 12 years building inside my company. So he loses control. He loses control, she confirmed, and Martin Voss does not lose control gracefully. She picked up her coffee, realized it had cooled, set it back down. "The FBI agent I spoke to, Agent Tran, she said they're treating this as a kidnapping and extortion conspiracy, not a terrorism case, which means they think the original plan was to land in Portland, take me off the aircraft under threat, and use me as leverage to force a halt to the merger. Which would have worked, Reid said. Almost certainly. The merger closes in 19 days. If I'm incapacitated or if I issue a withdrawal under duress. She stopped. Yes, it would have worked. But the captain went down. And the first officer was wounded, and suddenly they had a hijacked aircraft with no pilot and a fuel problem and no way to get to Portland, and the plan dissolved. She looked at her hands around the coffee cup. And the contingency was supposed to make sure that if they couldn't bring me in, nobody talked about it afterward. The room was quiet for a moment. Sophie shifted in her sleep, turned, settled. Voss, Reid said. Where is he now? That's the problem. She looked at him directly. He's not in any of his registered locations. His assistant told the FBI he left on a private trip 3 days ago. His personal aircraft flew to Zurich 2 days ago and hasn't filed a flight plan since. So he knew the operation might go wrong and he was already moving. That's what Tron thinks. And he knows by now that the contingency failed. Evelyn nodded slowly. Which means he knows there are 3 men in federal custody who can be traced back to him. And he knows I'm alive and talking to the FBI. And he knows... She stopped. That whatever he had on the aircraft didn't work, Reid finished. She looked at him. In the low lamplight of the hotel room, with the city quiet outside and Sophie sleeping 8 feet away, the composed CEO expression had given way to something more honest. Not panic, not the dramatic fear of someone who'd never faced a real threat, but the controlled, clear-eyed concern of a person who understood a dangerous situation with precision and was not pretending it was smaller than it was. The FBI is posting agents outside the hotel tonight, she said, and they want to move me in the morning to a more secure location while the investigation develops. She paused. I wanted to tell you in person, because if Martin Voss is aware that there was someone on that aircraft who neutralized his contingency, he is, Reid said. The news covered the arrest. They named me. Something crossed her face. I know, I saw. So whoever Voss talks to will have my name. Yes. He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. The situation had a specific shape to it that he recognized from a different life. The shape of a problem that had not finished developing, that had more moving parts than were currently visible, and that had a timeline attached to it that was not his to set. The merger closed in 19 days. Voss was mobile and aware. The 3 men in custody had information that could be traced, but that tracing would take time. Time was the variable none of them controlled. Sophie and I will be on the first flight to Portland in the morning, he said. Reid, she has school, he said. And I have a crew starting at 7 that's already behind schedule. My life is in Portland, and going back to it is the right call for Sophie. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I understand that. I'm not asking you to do anything differently. She paused. I'm telling you because I thought you deserved to know the shape of it, what you walked into tonight, and what it might still be. She held his gaze. And because I don't think you're a man who does well with incomplete information. He looked at her. It was, he thought, a remarkably accurate read of a person she'd known for about 10 hours, most of which had been spent in active crisis. He found that he wasn't surprised by it. She'd been reading the room correctly since Denver, from the moment she'd walked through the terminal and categorized 23 strangers by their actual need rather than their apparent status. That wasn't luck. That was the kind of intelligence that came from paying attention as a discipline, and Reid had a deep respect for paying attention as a discipline. What are you going to do? He said. I'm going to cooperate fully with the FBI, she said. I'm going to get to the closing date in 19 days, and I'm going to watch Voss Capital's movements very carefully, because Martin Voss is smart enough to know that the direct approach failed and patient enough to look for a different angle. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. He's been building his position in my company for 12 years. He doesn't walk away from that. No, Reid agreed. He doesn't. She stood up, folded the document, and put it in her jacket pocket. She looked tired, genuinely, not performatively tired, the kind that sat in the lines around the eyes and the set of the shoulders. He thought she probably didn't show it often. He thought it probably cost her something to show it now, even in this company. Get some sleep, she said, for what it's worth. You too, he said. She moved toward the door. He stood from the chair, not because she needed escorting, but because sitting while someone left felt wrong to him in a way he'd never been able to fully articulate. She stopped with her hand on the door handle and turned back once. "What you did tonight," she said. "On the aircraft. All of it." She stopped, and he could see her selecting words with the care of someone who meant to be precise. "I've worked with a lot of people who describe themselves as capable under pressure. Most of them are describing something they've never actually been tested on." She paused. "You were tested on it tonight. I watched you. I want you to know that I saw it. The whole of it, not just the landing." He didn't know what to say to that, which was unusual. "Thank you for Sophie," she said, "and for the 22 other people." She opened the door. "Good night, Reid." She left. He stood in the quiet room and listened to the door close and the sound of her footsteps receding down the carpeted hallway. And then he sat back down in the chair and looked at his daughter sleeping and thought about the 19 days to the merger closing and the man in a Zurich-adjacent unknown location who had decided to solve a corporate problem by putting a weapon on an aircraft. And he thought about the space between the man he'd tried to be for 6 years and the man who had walked into that cockpit. And he thought about Sophie's voice saying, "Those are the same person with the simple certainty of someone stating a fact that should have been obvious all along." He did not sleep. At 4 in the morning, he called his site foreman and left a voicemail explaining that he would be back in Portland by early afternoon and that the Beaverton crew should proceed with the framing and that he'd be on site by 3. He called his office manager and left a similar message. He called the number with the 202 area code and left his name and the hotel and his callback number, because whatever agency it was would call back when they called back, and there was no value in waiting anxiously. Then he sat by the window until the sky began to lighten. The knock came at 6:15. Not Evelyn. Heavier, 2 knocks, the cadence of official rather than personal. Reid was at the door in 4 steps and looked through the peephole before he opened it. 2 men. One he recognized from the base. Agent Tran had mentioned a partner. The other was new, older, with the particular bearing of someone senior in a structure that valued bearing. Reid opened the door. "Mr. Callahan?" the older one said. He produced credentials. FBI, Special Operations Desk, which was not the standard investigative branch. "Agent Carver, this is Agent Mullen. I apologize for the hour." "Don't," Reid said. "Come in." They came in. Carver looked at Sophie sleeping and lowered his voice accordingly, which Reid noted approvingly. Mullen stayed near the door. "We've had a development overnight," Carver said. "The primary contact from the aircraft, the point man, provided a name in exchange for consideration on his charges. We've been running verification through the night. We believe we know who organized the operation, and we believe we know his current location." "Voss," Reid said. Carver studied him. "Miss Carrington told you." "She told me what she knew. I filled in the rest." He crossed his arms. "Where is he?" "That's not something I can share with a civilian," Carver said, and his tone was not apologetic, but it was not unkind. "What I can tell you is that we're moving on it. What I want from you is a formal debrief on the contingency man, specifically the sequence leading to his detention. We need your account on record before his attorneys file this morning." "I'll give you whatever you need," Reid said. "I have a flight at 9:40. I need to be on it with my daughter." Carver looked at him for a moment. "We can work with that," he said. "One question first," Reid said. "Go ahead." "The operation on the aircraft. Was it purely about preventing the merger, or was there a secondary objective?" Carver's expression shifted. "Not much, but enough." He glanced at Mullen once. "What makes you ask that?" "The contingency was built for total elimination," Reid said. "If it was just about the merger, kidnapping Carrington was sufficient. You don't build a failsafe that kills 23 people, including children, just to prevent a corporate dilution. That's a level of commitment that means the merger is either more significant than it appears, or Carrington herself has something beyond it." He paused. "Which is it?" Carver looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, Mullen had gone very still. "The merger," Carver said carefully, "involves the acquisition of a defense technology subsidiary that Harwell holds under a separate structure. The subsidiary has contracts with 3 federal agencies that would transfer to Carrington Industries upon completion." A pause. "Voss Capital has a competing arrangement with a foreign investment group that becomes void the moment those contracts transfer." Reid absorbed this. "Foreign investment group," he said. "I've told you more than I should," Carver said. and the way he said it was clear and final. Reid nodded once. He understood the shape of it now. The full architecture that had been partially visible last night and was now complete. This wasn't just a corporate power struggle. This was Voss as a conduit for interests that needed those defense contracts to not transfer to American hands. And that need had been significant enough to put a weapon on a civilian aircraft. That was a different category of problem than Reid had gone to sleep thinking about. He looked at Sophie. She was stirring. The voices had reached her, the low ones, and she was surfacing in the slow spiral she always moved through between sleep and waking. One eye opened. She looked at the two men by the door with the uncomplicated assessment of a child who had, at this point, run out of capacity to be surprised by unusual morning situations. "Are those the police?" she said, her voice thick with sleep. "FBI," Reid said. She considered this. "Are you in trouble again?" "Still not in trouble." "Okay." She pulled the blanket up. "Is there breakfast?" "We'll find breakfast," he said. She closed her eye. Carver looked at Sophie and then at Reid, and something in the agent's professional composure shifted just slightly. The small, involuntary adjustment that happened when a person encountered something that reminded them of something else, something outside the case file. "We'll let you get her up," Carver said. "We'll be down the hall when you're ready." They left. Reid sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand on Sophie's back. She was breathing evenly again, maybe back asleep, maybe just resting in the comfortable in-between. Outside the window, Boise was beginning to move in the early light. The first cars, the orange-gray of a clear November morning, the foothills sharp against a sky that had nothing left of the storm. "Soph," he said quietly. "We need to get up. We've got a flight to catch." A pause. "Are we going home?" "Yeah," he said. "We're going home." She sat up slowly, hair in every direction, Captain Biscuit in her arms. She looked at him with the clear, unfiltered gaze of first morning, before the day's calculations had started. He looked back. He thought about all the things that were going to need saying, about who he'd been, about her mother, about the life he'd built the compartment walls around and the reasons he'd built them. He thought about how none of those conversations were simple, and all of them were overdue, and some of them were going to be hard. He thought Sophie would handle them better than he'd given her credit for. "After breakfast," she said, reading his face with the accuracy she'd apparently always had, and he'd apparently always underestimated. "You can tell me about the SEAL stuff." He looked at her. "All of it," she said. "Not the scary parts if you don't want, but the real parts." He sat with that for a moment. Outside, the morning light was getting stronger, filling the room with the ordinary gold of a clear day, the kind of light that made everything look the same as it always had, except that it wasn't. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, the real parts." Sophie nodded as if this had been decided a while ago, and she'd just been waiting for him to arrive at the same place. She got up to find her shoes, and Reid watched her, and somewhere in the building, a floor above them, the FBI was writing up its case files. And somewhere in an undisclosed European location, a man named Martin Voss was making calculations that had run out of room, and in 19 days a merger would close that would change the shape of a great many things, and none of that was resolved yet. And some of it was going to pull at the edges of Reid Callahan's carefully reconstructed civilian life for months to come. But right now his daughter was looking under the hotel bed for her left shoe, muttering to herself with the focused irritation of someone who had lost things before and had opinions about it, and Captain Biscuit was propped against the pillow watching the proceedings. And the morning was clear, and they were going home. Reid stood up, picked up both their bags, and waited for Sophie to find her shoe. She found it under the nightstand, held it up with the vindication of someone who had known all along where it was going to be. "Ready," she said. "Ready," he said. The flight to Portland was 47 minutes on a commercial carrier with a middle seat between them that Sophie immediately claimed as territory for Captain Biscuit, reasoning that the rabbit had been through an ordeal and deserved the extra space. The man in the window seat, who had the look of a frequent flyer who had seen most things, glanced at the stuffed rabbit and said nothing, which Reid appreciated. Sophie ate a bag of pretzels and looked out the window past the man's shoulder and asked exactly 3 questions about the SEAL years during the flight, all of them specific and none of them the ones Reid had been bracing for. She asked whether he had ever been underwater for a long time. She asked whether the training was harder than it looked on television. She asked whether his friends from that time were still his friends. He answered all 3 honestly. Yes, he had been underwater for what felt like a very long time, on more than one occasion, and the trick was to make peace with the discomfort rather than fight it. The training was harder than anything television had managed to represent, mostly because television couldn't convey what sustained cold and sustained sleep deprivation did to a person's ability to think, and that thinking clearly when everything in your body was screaming at you to stop was the actual point of all of it. And yes, his friends from that time were still his friends, in the particular way of people who had been through something together that they didn't need to explain to each other. She absorbed each answer with the focused attention she brought to things she was genuinely trying to understand, not just accumulate. Then she went back to looking out the window, and Reid looked at the back of the seat in front of him, and neither of them said anything more about it for the rest of the flight, and that was fine. There was no rule that said the important conversations had to happen all at once. Portland received them under low November clouds that were making up their minds about rain and hadn't committed yet. The baggage carousel was slow, the taxi line was long, and the driver who finally took them to their house in the Selwood neighborhood had the radio on low and no interest in conversation, which put him firmly in Reid's top tier of cab drivers. The house was a 1940s craftsman that Reid had spent 2 years renovating in the evenings and on weekends, which meant it was structurally sound and aesthetically uneven. The kitchen was finished and good, the master bathroom was halfway there, and there was a section of the back hallway that still had bare drywall because Reid kept finding more urgent things to attend to. Sophie had decorated her room herself, with Reid's permission and occasional assistance, and the result was the specific creative chaos of a child who had been given genuine autonomy and used it fully. He unlocked the front door and Sophie went inside first, the way she always did, reclaiming the house the way children reclaim familiar space after absence. Quickly, thoroughly, checking each room with the casual authority of ownership. Reid put their bags down in the entryway and stood in the hall for a moment. The house smelled like it always smelled. Wood and something faintly like the lemon cleaner his office manager had used on the counters last week, because she occasionally came by to check the place when he was traveling, one of the quiet kindnesses he had never figured out how to properly thank her for. It smelled like the particular silence of a house that had been waiting, and it smelled like the accumulated ordinariness of their life here, which was something Reid had built deliberately, year by year, and had never been so aware of the value of as he was standing in the hallway at 2:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. Sophie appeared from the direction of the kitchen. "There's nothing to eat," she said. "There's pasta and some old crackers. I'll go to the store." "Can we have soup?" "We can have soup." She disappeared back into the house, satisfied. Reid picked up his bag and took it to the bedroom and sat down on the edge of the bed and did the thing he'd been deferring since the hotel room. He stopped moving, and the evening caught up to him. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It was more like the way a large wave works when you're past the break. You feel the surge lifting you and then the slow pull back, and for a moment you're suspended in the between. He sat there and felt the weight of the last 18 hours settle into his body the way physical weight settles, and he let it settle, because he'd learned a long time ago that what you don't let land finds other ways to come home. He thought about Ortega, about her hands on the panel, trembling but finding the controls anyway. He thought about her voice, thin and precise, walking him through the gear sequence from a wound that should have taken her out of the conversation an hour earlier. He'd called the hospital from the Boise airport before their flight and been told she was out of surgery and in recovery, prognosis good, which was the most the duty nurse would give him over the phone. He was going to find a way to say something to her, though he hadn't yet worked out what. Thank you seemed insufficient. It also seemed like the only honest thing. He thought about the moment at 200 feet when the runway lights had appeared. He had described it to Holt and to Carver, and to Mullen in functional terms. Visual acquisition of the threshold, confirmation of glide slope, initiation of flare. Those were the accurate terms. What they didn't cover was the particular quality of that moment, the way the lights had come out of the darkness, with a completeness that was almost physical, the way his hands had already known what to do before his brain had finished registering what his eyes were seeing. The years between here and the last time he'd flown like that had collapsed in a way that was difficult to describe to people who hadn't experienced it, the past and the present suddenly occupying the same space, not in conflict but just present together, like two rivers joining. He sat with that for a while. Then he got up and went to the store and bought groceries, including the ingredients for the tomato soup Sophie had been specific about, and he came home and made dinner, and they ate together at the kitchen table, and Sophie told him her theory about why Captain Biscuit was better qualified than most adults she knew to deal with emergencies. And Reid listened with the complete attention he tried to always give her when she was working through something that mattered to her, which this clearly did. Because he's been through stuff, Sophie said. He's got the ear and everything, and he didn't fall apart. He had some help with the ear, Reid pointed out. That's okay. Asking for help is allowed. Reid looked at his soup. Dad, Sophie said. He looked up. She had the expression she got when she was about to say something she'd been building for a while. Are you going to keep being just a construction guy? I'm going to keep running the company, yeah. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. 8 years old, soup on her chin, completely serious. I don't know yet, he said, because that was the truth, and he had made a recent internal commitment to the truth. She nodded as if this were an acceptable answer, possibly the only acceptable one. Okay, she said, but you should think about it. I'm thinking about it. Good. She went back to her soup. Captain Biscuit thinks you should. Reid looked at the rabbit, propped against the fruit bowl on the counter where Sophie had installed him for the meal. The mismatched ear, the worn patches on both paws. I'll take it under advisement, he said. The weeks that followed were not a clean recovery arc. They were messy in the way that real time is messy, made up of ordinary things that kept being ordinary despite the fact that extraordinary things had recently happened. Reid was on the Beaverton site at 7 the next morning, 2 days behind where he'd needed to be, managing a framing crew that had done half what they should have because the lumber delivery mix-up had cost them 2 full days and nobody had made a decision in his absence that they'd felt qualified to make. He sorted it in 3 hours. He was back the next day and the day after. Sophie went to school on Wednesday with a note from Reid that was, as promised, more interesting than her teacher had been expecting. Ms. Abernethy, who was 29 and excellent at her job, sent back a brief email that said, Sophie seems okay. She told the class she flew through a storm with her dad and it was mostly fine. She seemed proud. Reid read it twice and then filed it under things he was going to let be what they were. The FBI contacted him 4 times over the following 2 weeks. 3 written depositions and 1 in-person session with Agent Carver in a Portland field office that lasted most of an afternoon. Carver was careful and thorough and gave away very little, which Reid had come to expect. What he did let slip at the end of the last session was that the situation with Voss Capital was progressing and that the 3 men from the aircraft had provided enough cooperative testimony to move the case significantly forward. Voss himself? Reid asked. Extradition is a process, Carver said, which was not an answer but was a specific kind of not an answer. The Foreign Investment Group. Carver looked at him. Mr. Callahan, you're not a federal agent. I know what I am, Reid said. I'm asking whether the people above Voss are being addressed or whether they're going to find another mechanism. A pause. The agencies involved are aware of the full structure, Carver said. That's all I can tell you. It was more than nothing. Reid decided to let it be sufficient. Evelyn called him on the 12th day. He was on the Beaverton site, standing on a plywood subfloor 16 feet up with a wind coming off the Tualatin Mountains that had opinions about his jacket when his phone rang with the New York number he'd saved after Boise. Is this a bad time? She said. I'm on a roof, sort of. I'll be quick. The merger closed this morning. He stood on the plywood and felt the wind and let that land. 19 days from the night over Idaho, and the thing Voss had put a weapon on an aircraft to prevent had happened anyway. Congratulations, he said, and meant it. Thank you. A pause. There's something else. I've been thinking about something since Boise, and I want to run it by you before I move forward with it. Run it. The children of military personnel and first responders. There's a foundation I want to establish. Support services, educational programs, mental health resources. Things that are chronically underfunded because the people who need them most are also the ones least likely to ask for help. She paused. I want someone to lead it who understands that population from the inside. Not a career nonprofit director, someone who's been in it. Reid was quiet for a moment. I have a construction company, he said. I know. I'm not asking you to give it up. The company can keep running. You have a management structure that functions. I looked into it. A pause. You're not an empire builder, Reid. You built a solid company, and you staff it well, and you trust your people. That's not nothing, but it also means it doesn't need you every hour of every day. You looked into my company. I look into things. It's how I'm built. No apology in it, just fact. I'm not trying to take over your life. I'm asking if you'd consider being useful in a different way, in addition to what you're already doing. He looked out over the site, the framing going up, the crew moving across the structure with the organized choreography of people who knew their work, the particular smell of cut lumber and wet earth that he'd built his civilian life around for 6 years because it was honest work that produced visible results and demanded nothing from the part of him he'd been trying to put away. He thought about what Sophie had said at the kitchen table. Are you going to keep being just a construction guy? She hadn't said it as a criticism. She'd said it as a genuine question, and genuine questions deserve genuine consideration. Tell me more about what it would look like, he said. She told him. It took 15 minutes, and she had clearly been thinking about it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. The organizational structure, the funding model, the specific gaps in existing services, the ways that military family support tended to reach the visible cases and miss the ones who were managing, the ones who were just barely keeping things together without asking for anything from anyone, because asking for things was not in the vocabulary they'd been raised with. Reid listened to all of it standing on a plywood subfloor in the wind. When she finished, he said, Sophie, what about her? She's part of this if I do it. Not as a case study or a poster child. Just the reason I understand what these families are actually going through is because I've been living it. I'm not separating that out. I wouldn't ask you to, Evelyn said. That's precisely why I want you. Another pause, longer this time. Give me 2 weeks, he said. Take 3, she said. Do it right. He took 3 weeks. He talked to his site foreman, who had been quietly ready for more responsibility for about a year, and received the expansion of his role with the contained satisfaction of someone who had been competent and patient and was glad to be recognized for both. He talked to his office manager, who said she had suspected something like this was coming since the news coverage from Idaho and was, in her words, basically fine with it, as long as he still came by the office on Fridays. He talked to a lawyer about the company's management structure, and to an accountant about the financial separation, and to Agent Carver one more time. Not about the case, but about the clearances involved in working adjacent to defense-contracted entities. A conversation Carver handled with the professional non-surprise of someone who had already run the calculation. He talked to Sophie last, or tried to, and found that she had already run her own calculation. You're going to do the foundation thing, she said. She was at the kitchen table doing homework, not looking up. This was Sophie's way of indicating she was listening completely. I'm thinking about it seriously. You're going to do it. He sat down across from her. What makes you say that? She looked up then, with the direct gaze that had always slightly unnerved him in the best possible way. Because you've been happy for the last 3 weeks in a way you weren't before. You're different when you're solving a hard problem. She paused. You were different on the plane. When things got bad, you got better. That's what happens to you. He didn't have an immediate answer for that. I'm going to be fine, she said, preempting what she correctly anticipated was coming next. I'm not going to fall apart because you're doing 2 things instead of 1. I know you're not. And you'll still be home for dinner most nights. And you'll still coach my soccer team. He blinked. You want me to keep coaching your soccer team? You're not a good coach, she said, with the affectionate candor she reserved for him exclusively. But you're consistent. The team likes you. He absorbed this. Thank you, I think. You're welcome. She looked back at her homework. Tell Miss Carrington yes. He called Evelyn the next morning and told her yes. The Callahan Family Initiative held its first event on a Saturday in late February, 4 months after the night over Idaho, at a community center outside Portland that had been repurposed from a former school building and still had the feel of a place that had been built for children and remembered it. Evelyn had moved quickly and well. The funding was in place, the organizational structure was solid, the first cohort of families had been identified through veteran services networks and first responder unions across 3 states. 41 families came to that first event, 63 children. Reid arrived early, before anyone else, the way he arrived at construction sites, to walk the space, understand what it actually was, as opposed to what the plan said it would be. Find the things that needed adjusting before they became problems. He walked through the main hall where the program materials were being set up, through the side rooms that had been arranged for different age groups, out to the back lawn that ran down to a small lake that the property backed onto. The February morning was cold and clear, the lake surface flat and still, a line of pine trees on the far bank going dark green into a pale sky. He stood at the edge of the lawn and looked at the water. He thought about the 6 years between leaving the teams and standing here. I thought about the morning after Claire's funeral when he'd driven home from the hospital with Sophie asleep in her car seat and had sat in the driveway of their house for 20 minutes, unable to go inside. Not because he was broken, though he was, in the ways that losing someone you've built your life around breaks you, but because he had not yet understood what came next, and he was a man who had always needed to understand what came next. He had made a decision in that driveway that was less a decision and more a turning away. A turning away from the man who had operated in classified spaces and toward the man who could be fully present for a 3-year-old girl who needed exactly one person in her world to be completely, unconditionally there. He had not regretted it. He wanted to be clear about that, even in the privacy of his own thinking. He had not regretted it for a single day. But he understood now that the turning away had cost something and that the cost had been not the SEAL he'd been. That man was fine. That man had done what he'd been trained to do and had done it well. But the integration. The two men had been living in the same body, in the same house, raising the same child, and Reid had been managing the distance between them with the specific exhaustion of someone maintaining a fiction that the person closest to him had seen through from the beginning. Sophie had always known they were the same person. He had just needed a night at 30,000 feet to learn it himself. He heard the cars in the parking lot, families arriving, the sound of children at a distance, that particular high, clear frequency that carried across open ground. He turned from the lake and walked back across the lawn toward the building. The morning organized itself. The way events organized themselves when the planning had been done properly, not smoothly, because nothing is smooth when you have 63 children and their parents in a building that's trying to do something new, but functionally, with the productive chaos of people who needed something and were beginning to find it. Reid moved through the rooms the way he moved through his construction sites, not as the most important person in the space, but as the person responsible for whether the space worked. He fixed a table that was wobbling. He found a box of supplies that had been delivered to the wrong room and carried it to the right one. He sat with a man named Darius, a former Army medic whose wife had died 6 months ago, who was sitting alone in one of the side rooms looking at his hands while his 2 kids were in the adjacent room with the other children. And Reid sat with him for 20 minutes and did not try to fix anything or say anything useful, just sat with the specific silence of someone who understood the shape of that particular loss and knew that the shape was not the same for any 2 people, and that the most honest thing you could give a person in it was your presence without your agenda. Darius looked up after a while. "You lose someone?" he said. "My wife," Reid said. 6 years ago." Darius nodded. He didn't say he was sorry. He said, "It gets different. People say better. It's more like different." "Yeah," Reid said. "That's the right word." They sat for another few minutes, and then the sounds from the adjacent room changed, and Darius stood up and went to check on his kids, and Reid sat for a moment alone before he went back to the main hall. He found Sophie in this main hall with 3 other children she had apparently already organized into some kind of game that involved the folding chairs and a set of rules that Reid could not immediately parse. Sophie had the specific quality of presence in group situations that she'd had since she was very small. Not the loudest person, not the one performing for the room, but the one around whom things organized themselves, the one who noticed who was left out and quietly closed the gap. He watched her for a moment without her knowing he was watching. He thought about Claire, who had been the same way. He thought that some things passed down through the specific mystery of who we are to each other, and that he was not sure what name to give that mystery, and that not having a name for it didn't make it less real. Evelyn appeared at his shoulder. She had been managing the program side of the morning, the introductions, the family services coordinators, the structured components, with the same efficiency she brought to everything, and she looked at 10:30 in the morning like she had been awake since 5 and was running on the energy of something that was working. Not triumph, not the satisfaction of a successful execution. Something quieter and more durable. "Darius Malone," she said quietly, not looking at him but at the hall. How is he doing? He came, Reid said. She nodded. That was the right answer, and she knew it was the right answer. Coming, for some of these families, was the whole achievement. Everything else was secondary. 41 families, she said. First event. You expected less? I hoped for 30. A pause. I've learned to hope for slightly less than I think is possible, so that reality has room to be better. Reid looked at her sideways. That's unusually humble for a CEO. I'm not humble, she said. I'm strategic about hope. He almost smiled at that. How's the Harwell integration going? Complicated, contentious, and proceeding on schedule, she said, which is about as well as a major acquisition can go. She paused. The defense subsidiary is under federal review now, as part of the Voss investigation. It's not slowing the integration, but it's present. Voss, Reid said. Extradition was approved last week, she said. The Swiss cooperated, which surprised almost everyone involved. She was quiet for a moment. He'll stand trial. The Foreign Investment Group. The FBI won't discuss it publicly, but the contracts are secure. Reid looked at the hall. Sophie's game had acquired 2 more participants and had apparently evolved rules of sufficient complexity that one child was trying to explain them to another with the earnest frustration of someone whose system makes perfect sense from the inside. Is it enough? He said. Not about Voss. About this. The hall, the families, the 41 who came, and the ones who hadn't yet. Evelyn considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. No, she said. Not nearly. But it's not supposed to be enough yet. It's supposed to be true and expandable and done with the right intention. She looked at him. It's supposed to be the beginning of something that we don't yet know the full shape of. He thought about that. He had been a man who needed to know the full shape of things, who needed the next step visible before he took the current one. It had made him excellent at certain kinds of work and had cost him something in the ability to be present in uncertainty, which was where most of the important things in a life actually lived. Sophie had cured him of some of that. The particular uncertainty of loving a child, of knowing that they would become someone you couldn't fully predict, that they would surprise you and challenge you and occasionally devastate you with the accuracy of their perceptions, had taught him, slowly and not without resistance, that not knowing the shape of what came next was not a failure of planning. It was just the condition of being alive and in relationship with other people. He supposed 30,000 feet over an Idaho mountain range in a fuel-leaking jet had reinforced the lesson. A boy of about 6 detached himself from Sophie's game and walked over to where Reid was standing. He had the look of a child who made decisions quickly and without preamble, and he looked up at Reid with the directness of someone who had not yet learned that adults required a social runway before being approached. "Are you the man who landed the plane?" he said. Reid looked down at him. "Where did you hear about that?" "My mom told me. She said you were going to be here and that you used to be a soldier." "I was," Reid said, "but now you're not." "Now I'm not." The boy considered this with the focused attention of a child for whom the distinction mattered in a way he hadn't yet fully articulated. "My dad was a firefighter," he said. "He's not one anymore either. He got hurt." "I'm sorry," Reid said. "Is he here today?" "He's in the other room. He didn't want to come, but my grandma made him." Reid crouched down to the boy's level, which was a thing he'd learned to do because Sophie had taught him, early, that conversations with children worked differently when you weren't looking down at them. "I'm glad he came," he said. "Sometimes people who don't want to come somewhere are the ones who most need to." The boy thought about this carefully. "My dad says he's fine," he said, "but he's not fine." "Yeah," Reid said. "That happens." "Why do they say they're fine when they're not?" Reid looked at this kid, maybe 6, maybe 7, with the old eyes that kids got when they'd been paying close attention to the adults around them and had absorbed more than anyone realized. He thought about how to answer. He thought about the 20 minutes he'd spent with Darius Malone in the side room. He thought about 6 years of telling Sophie and his crew and his clients, and occasionally himself, that he was fine. "Because they're trying to protect the people they love from worrying," he said. "And because they're not always sure how to ask for what they need. And sometimes because they've spent so long being the person everyone else relies on that they don't know how to be the person who needs something for a change." The boy sat with this seriously. "That's a lot of reasons. People are complicated. My grandma says that too. Your grandma's right. The boy looked at him for another moment, as if confirming that the conversation had given him what he needed, and then he turned and went back across the hall at a run, rejoining the larger group of children with the unceremonious efficiency of a kid who has gotten his question answered and is ready to move on. Reid stood back up. He felt Evelyn watching him, and he didn't look at her because whatever expression was on his face right now was not for managing, and she had the good grace not to say anything. The morning moved forward. Lunch happened, managed by volunteers with the organized persistence of people who understood that feeding a room of children was a logistical operation that required commitment. Reid sat with 3 different families over the course of the meal. A wife whose husband was currently deployed and who was managing 2 kids and a part-time job and a level of loneliness she had been systematically not talking about for 8 months. A man who had left the Marines with injuries that had ended his service and started a grieving process he hadn't been told to expect because nobody prepared you for grieving the person you'd been before the injury. A young woman, not much older than 25, whose father had been a police officer and had died in the line of service when she was 19, and who was here because her own 6-year-old had recently started asking questions she didn't know how to answer. Reid was not a therapist. He was not a social worker. He was not trained in the formal language of trauma or grief or post-service transition. What he was someone who had lived inside all of those things without a manual, and who had made enough mistakes and found enough solid ground that he had something honest to offer. He didn't offer advice. He mostly asked questions and listened to the answers and let the people he was talking to hear themselves, which was often the thing that was missing. Not information, not guidance, but a witness. Someone paying close enough attention that the person talking felt, for the duration, that their experience was real and visible and worth attending to. Sophie, at some point in the mid-afternoon, sat down beside him at one of the tables with a plate of cookies that appeared to be an unauthorized acquisition from the dessert station. She put one on the table in front of him without comment. He picked it up. They sat together in the comfortable silence that had always been one of the best things about their particular relationship, the ability to be in the same space without filling it. Outside, through the windows along the back wall, the lake was catching the late afternoon light, going silver and flat, the pine trees on the far bank casting long reflections. Some of the children had migrated to the back lawn, running in the loose, aimless way of children who have been inside for a while and need to move. The low winter sun was doing what it could, and the lawn was bright for a February afternoon in Oregon. Reid watched Sophie watching the kids outside. "This is good," she said. Not enthusiastically, not performatively, just as a statement of fact, the way she made statements of fact. "Yeah," he said. "That boy, the one with the red jacket." She gestured toward the lawn. "His dad's in there." She nodded toward the building. "He won't come outside." "I know. His son keeps looking at the window." Reid looked. The boy in the red jacket was on the lawn with the other kids, but she was right. Every 3rd or 4th pass, he glanced back at the windows of the building. Not desperately, not obviously, just checking. The way children check, confirming the presence of the person they're anchored to. "I used to do that," Sophie said. "Check to make sure you were there." He looked at her. "When?" "When I was little, after Mom died." She picked up her cookie, turned it in her hands. "At school, at the park, I'd look to make sure you hadn't disappeared." She said it matter-of-factly, without drama. "I don't do it anymore, but I understand why he does it." Reid didn't say anything for a moment. "You never told me that," he said. "You never asked." A pause. "Also, I didn't have the words for it until recently." He thought about all the things children carried without the words for them, and how they found the words eventually, and how the finding was its own kind of arrival. He thought about Sophie at 3 and 4 and 5, looking for him in crowds, confirming he was there, and him not having known what that was. He had been there. That much he had done right. He had been there every time she looked. "I'm going to go outside," Sophie said. She stood, took her cookie. "That boy's going to want someone to play with who understands about the dad stuff." Reid watched her go. She pushed through the door at the back of the hall and walked out into the cold February afternoon and across the lawn toward the group of children. And the boy in the red jacket looked up when she came over, and she said something that made him laugh. And within 30 seconds, they were running with the other kids. Reid sat at the table with his cookie and the silver light on the lake and the sound of the building around him. Families eating, talking, someone crying quietly in one of the side rooms, someone else laughing in a way that sounded like they hadn't laughed in a while and were surprised to find themselves doing it. He thought about the man he'd been in the Navy, the one who'd operated in cold water and broken places, and the specific darkness of missions that didn't make it into any file that would ever be declassified. He thought about the man he'd been for 6 years in Portland, the one who'd managed crews and site schedules and school pickups and mismatched thread on a rabbit's ear. He had believed for a long time that those two men were in tension, that they were irreconcilable, that being fully one meant being less of the other. He understood now that the tension had been in him, not between them. The SEAL had made him capable, the father had made him worth something, and the thing they shared, the thing that had been there in both lives, that had put him in the left seat of a dying aircraft at 30,000 feet, and had also put him on a plywood subfloor at 7 a.m. for 6 years, and had put him at this table in this room today, was the same thing, the need to be useful to people who needed him, the unwillingness to walk away from a hard problem, the specific comfort he found in responsibility rather than in its absence. That was not two men. That had always been one man. He thought about Claire, about the way she had looked at him in the early years, before Sophie, before the end of his service, with the expression of someone who understood what she had married more completely than he understood himself. She had known. She had known what he was made of and had loved him in full knowledge of it, including the parts he'd been slow to accept. He missed her with the quality of missing that didn't diminish but changed, became less like a wound and more like a scar, which was still there, still visible, but no longer the thing that organized the sensation of your body around it. He carried her the way you carried the dead people who had mattered, not as absence, but as presence in a different form. She was in Sophie's eyes. She was in the way he made decisions. She was in the 20 minutes he'd spent with Darius Malone, not saying anything useful, just staying. The boy in the red jacket came back inside through the rear door. He looked at the room, found something, and walked toward one of the side rooms where his father was presumably still sitting. Reid watched him go. A minute later, both of them appeared at the rear door. The boy and a man who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone for whom movement required thought, the adjustment of someone living in a body that didn't do what it had once done. But he came through the door, and he came out onto the lawn, and the boy took his hand, and they stood together at the edge of the lawn in the late afternoon light and looked at the lake. Reid looked at them from inside the window. He did not feel like a hero. He had never felt less like a hero, actually, which he took as evidence that he was on the right track. Heroes were a story you told about people to make the complicated things simple. What he felt was more specific and less dramatic than that. He felt like a man who had found, after a long time of looking in the wrong place, the shape of the life he was supposed to be living. Not a perfect shape, not resolved, incomplete in the particular way that anything real is incomplete, with jagged edges and unfinished sections, and at least one hallway that still had bare drywall in it. But true. The afternoon light came through the windows and crossed the hall floor, and outside on the lawn, Sophie was running with 6 other children toward the lake's edge in the loose, certain way of children who are not afraid of where they're going, and the man in the red jacket's son was laughing about something, and the pines on the far bank were dark against the pale winter sky. Reid Callahan sat at the table in the community center that used to be a school and ate his unauthorized cookie and watched the world he'd built from the pieces available to him, which were not all the pieces he'd wanted and not the ones he'd planned for, but were, when you put them together honestly, sufficient.